The conventional story is that the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, 1945 forced Japan's surrender and ended World War II. The actual story, buried in declassified Soviet and Japanese archives, is that what broke Japan's war cabinet was not the bomb alone, but the Soviet Union's surprise declaration of war on August 8th, 1945. Japan's entire endgame strategy had been built on keeping the Soviets neutral and using them as peace brokers. When Stalin moved, that plan, the only plan they had, collapsed in a single day. Japan's Supreme War Council didn't fear the second bomb. They feared fighting the Soviets on the ground in Manchuria with nothing left. The bomb ended the war. But it may not have been the reason. August 1945. The war in Europe was already over. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead in a bunker beneath the rubble of his own empire. The flags of the Allied nations flew over cities that had been battlegrounds for 6 years. But in the Pacific, the war was not ending. It was accelerating. On the island of Kyushu, Japan's military had buried 1 million soldiers into the rock and earth, waiting. American military planners estimated that a land invasion, Operation Downfall, would cost between 200,000 and 1 million American lives, and perhaps 10 times that many Japanese. What happened in the next 11 days would reshape the modern world. What happened in those 11 days, the full truth of it, was not understood for decades. It begins not with a bomb. It begins with a man in Moscow, with a piece of paper, and a decision made in secret. To understand what changed in August 1945, you have to understand the war Japan's leadership believed they were fighting. It was not the same war the Americans believed they were fighting. Japan's Supreme War Council, the Big Six, were not deluded. By the summer of 1945, they knew the war was lost in military terms. The question was never whether they would lose. It was how they would negotiate a surrender without destroying the imperial institution, without the emperor being tried as a war criminal, possibly executed. Japan's military and political leadership were, in the summer of 1945, engaged in a desperate diplomatic strategy. They called it Ketsugo, and its central pillar was the Soviet Union. Since 1941, the USSR and Japan had maintained a non-aggression pact. Japan's Guandong Army, 1 million men, occupied Manchuria along the Soviet border. But the Soviets were tied up in Europe. Both sides had reasons to stay out of each other's war. Japan's strategy in mid-1945 was to use the Soviets as diplomatic intermediaries to broker a negotiated end to the war, one that preserved the imperial system. They had even sent peace feelers through Moscow. Japan's ambassador in Moscow, Naoto Sato, was sending cable after cable back to Tokyo, saying, "The Soviets will not help us. They are going to enter the war." Tokyo ignored him. Sato's warnings were not ignored out of stupidity. They were ignored because Japan's leaders could not afford for him to be right. If the Soviets entered the war, the last option Japan had, the only diplomatic lifeline, vanished. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles east of Moscow, inside the most classified program in human history, a different clock was ticking. The Manhattan Project cost the equivalent of nearly $30 billion in today's money. It employed over 130,000 people, most of whom had no idea what they were building. The scientists at Los Alamos called the bombs by names. One was Little Boy. One was Fat Man. They had tested only one device. At Trinity, New Mexico, July 16, 1945. It worked. President Harry S. Truman, en route to the Potsdam Conference in Germany, received a coded message. It read, "Babies satisfactorily born." At Potsdam, Truman pulled Stalin aside. Almost casually, he mentioned that the United States had developed a weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin showed almost no reaction. We know now why Stalin wasn't surprised. Soviet intelligence, Klaus Fuchs, the Rosenbergs, others had been feeding information about the Manhattan Project to Moscow for years. Stalin already knew about the bomb. What he was calculating at that very moment was timing. How quickly could Soviet forces mobilize in the Pacific? Could the USSR enter the war and claim its share of the post-war order in Asia before Japan surrendered to the Americans alone? Two races were underway in August 1945. The Americans were racing to use the bomb before a land invasion became necessary. The Soviets were racing to enter the Pacific War before the bomb ended it, because only a nation at war could claim a seat at the peace table. Neither side told Japan, and Japan, desperately waiting for Moscow to save them, had no idea either race was happening. August 6, 1945, 8:15 in the morning. The Enola Gay B-29 superfortress piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets dropped a uranium bomb over the center of Hiroshima. The explosion killed between 70 and 80,000 people immediately. By the end of 1945, between 90,000 and 160,000 would be dead from the bomb and its effects. In Tokyo, the initial report was confused. Communications from Hiroshima had gone silent. Early dispatches described only a blinding flash and total destruction. The Japanese military initially suspected a massive conventional bombing raid. Truman announced the bomb publicly, a weapon harnessing the basic power of the universe, he called it. But the critical reaction in Tokyo wasn't what you'd expect. The War Minister, Korechika Anami, immediately argued that the Americans could only have one or two of these weapons. Japan still had millions of soldiers. The national spirit, Yamato Damashii, could not be broken by a bomb. He said almost exactly like that. General Anami was not a monster. He was a man trapped in a system, a military structure in which surrender was culturally and institutionally unthinkable, and in which admitting defeat meant admitting that every sacrifice had been meaningless. He would die rather than sign the surrender. And he did. But inside the government, a man was working to end the war, and doing it in secret, walking a razor's edge between peace and assassination. His name was Marquis Koichi Kido. Kido was the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, essentially the emperor's closest advisor. He had access to Emperor Hirohito that no one else had. And by the summer of 1945, Kido was convinced that Japan had to end the war. Not because of the bombs. He'd reached this conclusion months earlier. His diaries, which survived the war, are remarkable documents. He was threading a needle. He had to move the emperor toward a surrender decision without triggering a military coup. The Japanese military had, in fact, already planned for exactly this scenario. If the civilian government or the emperor moved toward surrender, a faction of young army officers was prepared to seize the palace, intercept the emperor's surrender broadcast, and continue the war regardless. This nearly happened. There was a coup attempt. August 14th to 15th, 1945. A group of officers stormed the imperial palace to find and destroy the phonograph recording of the emperor's surrender announcement before it could be broadcast. They failed. The recording had been hidden, but it came within hours of succeeding. If those officers had found that recording, there would have been no surrender announcement. The war would have continued. History turned on a hidden vinyl recording. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Between the bomb on Hiroshima and the emperor's broadcast, between August 6th and August 15th, 9 days passed. 9 days in which Japan did not surrender. And in those 9 days, something happened that the textbooks largely omit. August 8th, 1945, 2 days after Hiroshima. In Moscow, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov summoned the Japanese ambassador, Naoto Sato, the same man who had spent months warning Tokyo that the Soviets were not going to help them, to the Foreign Ministry. It was 5 p.m. Molotov read from a prepared statement. The Soviet Union, in accordance with its obligations to its allied partners, was declaring war on Japan. Effective immediately, Sato reportedly sat in silence after Molotov finished. There was nothing to say. Everything he had warned Tokyo about, for months, had come true. The non-aggression pact, which Japan had been counting on, had been formally abrogated. The Soviets had been planning this since Yalta, where Roosevelt had secretly promised Stalin entry into the Pacific War in exchange for attacking Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. Germany fell in May. 3 months later, to the day, August 8th, the Soviets moved. In the early hours of August 9th, 1.6 million Soviet troops crossed into Manchuria in a coordinated assault along a 4,000-kilometer front. The Japanese Guandong Army, which had been stripped of its best units to defend the home islands, collapsed within hours in many sectors. This is the moment that historians like Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, who spent years in Soviet, Japanese, and American archives, have argued is the actual turning point. The Soviet entry shattered Japan's last diplomatic strategy. Japan's entire peace plan depended on a neutral USSR. The moment that was gone, the war cabinet lost not just a battle. They lost their only endgame. There was no plan B. On the same day, August 9th, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb. This one on Nagasaki. 70 to 80,000 more dead. There's a document. The minutes of Japan's Supreme War Council meeting on August 9th. They met in an underground bunker. And what's striking when you read those minutes is what the debate was actually about. It was not primarily about the atomic bombs. It was about the Soviet entry. Prime Minister Suzuki opened by saying, "The entry of the Soviet Union into the war this morning has fundamentally changed the situation." That's the first item. The bombs are secondary. The Supreme War Council was deadlocked. 3 members wanted to continue fighting. 3 wanted to surrender, but only with conditions protecting the emperor's status. Deadlocked cabinets in Japan did not break their deadlock. It was unprecedented. What happened next had never happened before in modern Japanese history. They asked the emperor to decide. Here's what the history books say happened. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs. The Japanese, horrified by the unprecedented destruction, surrendered. The bombs saved hundreds of thousands of lives, possibly millions, by making a land invasion unnecessary. This is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The Truman administration had a political and historical interest in one narrative, that the bomb worked, that it was decisive, that it was therefore justified. And for 50 years, that narrative went essentially unquestioned in Western historiography. The bomb ended the war. Full stop. What the Soviet archives, opened after 1991, and the Japanese imperial records showed, when historians like Hasegawa and Kazuhiko Tamatsu examined them, was far more complicated. Japan's war cabinet held emergency meetings after Hiroshima. They did not vote to surrender. After Nagasaki, they still did not reach consensus. The thing that broke the deadlock wasn't a bomb. It was the realization that the Soviet Union, the only power they believed might broker peace, was now their enemy, and that they were completely alone. Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, a historian at the University of California, Santa Barbara, spent a decade in 3 countries' archives. His conclusion, published in his 2005 book, Racing the Enemy, was stark. It was the Soviet entry, not the bomb, that was the decisive factor in Japan's surrender decision. I want to be careful about how this is framed, because it can be misunderstood. This is not an argument that the bombs were irrelevant. They were catastrophic events. They killed hundreds of thousands of people. They proved that the United States had a weapon of almost incomprehensible power. But the question of why Japan surrendered when it did, and why the war ended in August of 1945 rather than November or 1946, the evidence increasingly points to August 8th and the Soviet declaration, not August 6th. This matters. It matters because the story of how wars end shapes the stories nations tell about themselves. The United States spent decades believing and teaching that atomic weapons had proven their ultimate utility in 1945. That nuclear deterrence was validated by history. But if the bomb was not the decisive factor, asterisk, historian number 2 on screen, quiet, measured. Historian number 2, then the entire post-war nuclear calculus is built, at least partly, on a misreading of what actually happened. Nations acquired nuclear arsenals partly because everyone assumed this is what ended World War II. If that assumption is wrong, or even just less certain than we've believed, the implications are significant. Not just historical, moral, strategic, significant. On September 2nd, 1945, Japanese officials signed the formal instruments of surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided. He said, "It is my earnest hope, indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge. The war was over. 60 to 80 million people were dead across 6 years of global conflict. And the peace that followed was shaped, partly, by a set of misunderstandings about how it ended. There's a profound irony in the post-war order. The United States wanted to keep the Soviets out of the post-war Pacific settlement. That's part of why Truman used the bomb when he did, racing the Soviet entry. But the Soviet entry happened anyway. August 8th, and the Soviets occupied the northern part of Korea, which led, 5 years later, to the Korean War. So the very thing Truman was trying to prevent, Soviet influence in Asia, happened regardless. There were other near misses that history chose not to mention for decades. The coup attempt on August 14th. The officers who nearly found the emperor's recording. If that coup had succeeded, if those officers had found and destroyed that recording, what would have happened? The military faction that wanted to fight to the last man was not a fringe. They had broad support within the army. Japan had been preparing for Operation Ketsugo, the final defense of the home islands, for months. The casualty projections on both sides for an invasion were staggering. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. The peace came by inches. The peace also came with a price that is still being debated. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Hibakusha, suffered not just injury, but generations of stigma. Discrimination. Radiation illness, no doctor fully understood. Many never spoke publicly of what they experienced. One thing that tends to get lost in the geopolitical analysis is the human reality of what a strategic decision meant at ground level. When we debate whether the bomb or the Soviet entry was more decisive, we're abstracting over the deaths of somewhere between 130,000 and 200,000 people in 2 cities. Those are not numbers. They are people. The historical debate matters, but it should never become comfortable. They call it Jimbaku Dome, the dome of the original Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall. It was almost directly beneath the hypocenter. The intense downward force of the blast, rather than destroying it sideways like everything around it, left the skeletal frame standing. A monument by accident, a silence that speaks. History is not the past. History is the story we agree to tell about the past. And the story the world agreed to tell about August 1945, for most of the 20th century, was simple, clean, and useful. A weapon of unimaginable power had been used. The enemy had surrendered. The war was over. But in the archives, in the letters of Ambassador Sato that no one read for decades, in the minutes of the August 9th War Cabinet meeting, in the diary of Marquis Kido, a more tangled truth was waiting. A truth about men running out of options. About a country that had built its final hope on the assumption that a foreign power would save it. About the moment that hope died. Not in a blinding flash from the sky, but in a bureaucrat's office in Moscow at 5 in the afternoon when a foreign minister read from a piece of paper. When does it matter which factor was more decisive? I think it does. Not to diminish the sacrifice of anyone who fought in that war. Not to relitigate Truman's decision. That's its own enormous debate. But because accuracy matters. Because when we tell ourselves a simpler story than the truth, we make worse decisions about the future. And in 1945, the future that was being decided, whether anyone knew it or not, was the nuclear age. The world that emerged from August 1945 had nuclear weapons at its center. 9 nations now possess them. The combined arsenal can end civilization multiple times over. And the doctrine that justified their existence, that nuclear weapons end wars rather than merely pause them, was built in part on a story. A story about 11 days in August. A story that is true and incomplete. The day World War II changed forever was not one day. It was 11. And the most important day of those 11 may not be the one you remember. Tsuyoshi Hasegawa's Racing the Enemy, 2005, was the first major scholarly work to synthesize Soviet, Japanese, and American archives on Japan's surrender decision. His conclusions remain debated and important. The Hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, have told their stories for decades through the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum and the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum. The Soviet declaration of war on Japan, August 8, 1945, remains one of the least discussed pivotal events of the 20th century.